Alright, so I'm getting prepared to put the guides on my rod. As you can see, I've put on a couple of under wraps already. I like an under wrap under the feet of my guides because of the guides bear so much pressure when you're fighting in fish. You don't want those feet digging into the naked rod blank. So, making it match my decorative wrap, I'm putting in a copper under wrap, and I'll come over that with green. And what I'll do is I'll take my guide foot and I'll measure it on a small tape measure and adjust it here so that I know I just put it up, and that when I get to the end of it, that's where it stops. So I started here. I'm going to start towards the tip. I'm going to work towards the butt, and I'll terminate this when it's just under an inch long for these. But I'll go ahead and put my under wrap on all of them. Now, I'm a little concerned that this rod is not going to have quite the action I want out on the tip. I like a pretty soft rod on the tip for my crappie. But that being said, even the striper rods I've made are so sensitive that I can feel crappie biting using my striper rod. And if that's all I had to fish with, I could pick up a striper rod and crappie fish. But for my ideal fishing, I want a softer tip on that rod. So I'm concerned with this one not being as soft as I want, so I'm going to use double foot guides. Double foot guides, you can see here and here. Now, if I was concerned with it possibly going to be too soft, I would use single foot guides, which were typically used on a spinning rod, to lighten it up here. The more weight I put out here on the end, the more action that rod's going to have. And you can't alter the action a great deal, but you can alter it a little bit by the weight of your guides, and then a little bit more by how much epoxy you put out on the tip. And this is going to be a Roberts wrap, as I mentioned earlier. So here's my 0 axis, and I've got my tip pointing down because these guides are going to roll their way around to the bottom of the rod to the 180-degree axis out here on the end. Roberts wrap, some people call it spiral wrap. Anyway, so my first 4 guides are going to be used to roll it around to the bottom, and my last 5 guides are just going to be spaced right so that it won't put excess pressure on the rod if I catch a big fish. Well, that's more important than you might think, and you might say, well, this is just a crappie rod anyway. Well, I went crappie fishing yesterday, and I don't know why it was there, but I hooked an 8-pound striper out of a brush pile and fought him in and landed him on a crappie rod. A rod with much lighter action than this one. That rod was bent over double, and it's a graphite rod. But the reason it didn't break was because I had the spacing on the guides correct. If the spacing is incorrect, it'll make weak points on the rod, and when you accidentally hook that really big fish, not the species you're intending, it'll break your rod. So the spacing is important. Well, I'm getting ready to start putting guides on. You see I've got my under wrap on all the way down the rod. And starting from the tip, and it doesn't matter which end you start from, but I'm starting from the tip because I'm putting a spiral wrap on. And that I'm going to put my first 5 guides on. That'll leave the 4 guides that are spiraling around the rod, and I'll use these 5 guides to help me get my spiral just right. And I like to spiral them where on the 4 guides towards the reel seat, the line hits the center of the guide as it makes the 180-degree wind around the rod. And if you take your time and adjust each guide, that's pretty easy to do. And I hadn't done it yet, but out here on the tip I have a white glow-in-the-dark thread that I've had for a while, and I just like putting those out on the tip of my crappie rods. I seldom fish in low light conditions, but they're kind of handy when you do. Now on this one, you can see I've got my under wrap on, as I said, and I've started my thread. My guide is taped on, and now if you're having trouble jumping over the foot on the guide, you can take your thread and pull that thread over the foot, and that line will go up and over the thread and on the guide. Now what I usually do though is I'm going to take my guides and grind a little bit off that foot, and I mentioned that before, so let me set the camera down and see if I can get one up close to the camera and show you what I've done. Now this is getting pretty precise for this little camera. I'm not sure it'll pick it up, but if you look out here, you can see where I've ground the end off just a little bit so that the thread will slide up on there. Okay, now so if you look on your bait casting guides, you'll see one foot has 2 supports on it and the other foot has just the one. And so I don't know that it really matters which way you turn those, so long as they're all turned the same way. And just as a matter of habit, I always turn the double end towards the reel seat, and I do that every time so that I don't ever make a mistake and turn one the other direction in a rod wrap and then have to strip that guide off and redo it. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get this first guide wound on there. Alright, so I use that thread to climb up on the foot. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut this tag end off. I'm up on there. And because I have such a short distance to pull my pull thread for pull string for holding the line, I'm going to go ahead and start my pull string. And I use a lot of extra precautions going up there to make sure my thread is nice and straight and it's going to look nice. Now, I know some people don't think you need a under wrap under your feet, but I think you do. So anyway, that's what I do. So now I've got that one side of that wound up there. It's time to clip my thread and pull it through. My pull loop. So again, as before, I don't want a bunch of thread sticking out, so I'm going to pull it over and measure it so that it's shorter than my pull loop, so that when I pull it out I don't have a tag end sticking through the thread. And I've gone over that before, but I'll just go over it again. And there you see it's on there, nice and neat, no thread sticking up out of the wrap. And so now I can go ahead and take the tape off the other side. One side will hold it, and I can put my thread on the other side of the guide. Continuing to work down the rod with my guides. See, I have the one put on, I just got half of another one. And you can see I went ahead and put on my white glow-in-the-dark thread. If your guides aren't just exactly straight as you're putting them on, don't be concerned with that, because you can move them just a little bit before you put epoxy on them. And that's one of the things I do once I've gotten all my guides on, and I try to get them straight as I go, but I look the rod over real careful and make sure my guides are straight on the rod. And now if you're making a rod for someone else and those guides are crooked, they will notice those crooked guides right off the bat and think they've received an inferior product. Well, realistically, the guides being straight, it's just purely aesthetic. It makes the rod look better. But if they're a little bit crooked, it's not going to make the rod fish any differently, but it sure won't look good. And you're wanting your rod to look good also. So take the extra time to make your guides nice and straight. Now these will be, they'll be straight up to here. And as I mentioned before, then I'll start my spiral wrap, winding them around the rod. So let me go ahead and put the thread on the reel seat end of this guide, and then I'll get the other two on, and we'll pick up again when I start on the spiral wrap. I have my upper 5 guides placed, and now I'm starting on my 4 spiral guides. I have 2 of them taped in place. Basically, I just locked my rod wrapper down and put a reel in the reel seat, run line through them, and I'm going to work my way around the rod and tape the guides on. And I think I mentioned before, the idea is to get the line to strike the center of the guide as much as possible on each guide. And as you curl the line around, that'll change where it's set the center on the previous guides. And so by the time you've got out here on the 4th guide, you've made your 180 degrees turn around the rod. As for you unwinding the guides around, across the span of 4 guides is it keeps the rod from losing casting distance, because you're making a 180-degree turn around the blank with the guides. And there it is. You can see our number 4. I'm right straight in the center, and I need to adjust a couple of guides, and there we go. So I've got my spiral guides winding around the rod, and my line hitting the 5th guide from the reel seat right in the center of the guide. Now, I had someone ask me one time if this would work on a spinning reel, and there is no reason to put a spiral wrap on a spinning reel. The guides are already underneath the rod. The reason you put the spiral wrap on is to keep that rod from wanting to flip over when you're fighting a fish, because you got your line up on top and you put pressure on it, it's going to want to flip around to the bottom. And basically all I'd have to do to get it to flip around is go and release the lock on my rod wrapper, and just the weight of the reel will make that rod flip over to underneath. And what we're doing in putting this spiral wrap on there is we're taking some of the stress off of your wrist when you're fishing. It's the whole point for it. So anyway, I've run my line through here, and I just tied a small pair of scissors on the bottom of it to hold the line straight. I don't want anything too heavy. I'm just trying to see where my line is hitting the center of the guides. So now that I've got that marked, I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping these guides. And I'll show in a little more detail putting the guide on. It's kind of hard to show putting these really small guides on, because everything is so small and it's just hard to see. The process I like to use on my spiral guides is starting with the guide closest to the reel seat, and that's just to hold everything in place as far as line. And then if anything moves, any of my tape comes off, and I sling a guide off while I'm putting these other ones on, I'm gonna check it again. I'll run the line through there and make sure I'm still hitting at the center. I'm starting with this guide closest to the reel seat because I've already got 5 guides on it on the tip to hold that in straight. So I need this one to start my wrap with, my guides. Well, I mentioned earlier that I used braided fishing line as my pull loop, and some braided fishing lines are slicker than others. I'm using a brand right now that's very slick, very limp. I actually use it for casting a 1/8 ounce jig with a bait casting rod because it casts so well. But it's also very slick, so when I use it to pull as a pull thread, I can have a lot more thread underneath my wrap, and the string will still pull. The pull string will still pull. Where if you have something that's rough, or just a plain piece of thread, it won't pull as well, and many times it'll break and you wind up having to put that piece on again. That's part of the reason why I test my pull string each time, make sure it's going to pull, and as we see, that one will pull. So I'll go ahead and cut it and terminate that wrap. And again, pull my line in tight here. Then I'm going to cut it off shorter than the end of my pull string, where the pull string is coming out of the thread, so that I don't pull the tag end of the thread up and out. And there we have that guide in place. And that will hold the bottom end. Now sometimes on these larger guides, you're going to want to leave your tape on the other end, and at least until you get started up the foot with your thread, because it'll want to rock on you, and that thread will want to slip underneath this foot instead of climb up over it, and we're wanting it to climb up over it. So I'm going to leave that thread on, or that tape on, until I've got this thread started. And there we go. So now I can cut this tag in off and let my thread start climbing up on the foot of the guide. And there we go, I've started up. So you can see I've started up the foot right here. So I can go ahead and remove this piece of tape. And remember, I said earlier, if your guides aren't exactly right, you know, straight or whatever we're trying to do with it, you can scoot them over just a little ways before you put epoxy on it. And that's going to be part of my, before epoxy goes on, I'm going to check this thing over several times to make sure everything is just right. I mean, my guides are straight, I don't have any rough pieces of thread. If I do have a rough piece of thread or guide's not straight, well, if the guide's not straight, I'm going to straighten the guide. And you can see, if you take your tension off, you can easily get off on your thread, as I did right there. Anyway, if my guide's not straight, I'll straighten my guide, and if there's something wrong with my thread, I'm going to take care of that. So as far as how far up this foot to come, I'm generally going to come up the foot to the point where it starts making the curve. On the double foot, you'll actually close this little bitty gap right here. So I've got 3 or 4 more wraps to do that. And on the single foot, you can see the thread start curving up. And if you look real closely right here, you can see this thread starting to curve up the leg. So that's going to be good there. I'm going to terminate that thread right there. So as usual, I'm going to stick my burnishing tool through the pull loop and make sure it's going to pull well. And there we go. Pulled just fine. So there's my first guide for my spiral wrap. And the first one, it doesn't spin very far around the rod. Really, it doesn't spin very far until the third guide. As you can see, I put a second band of tape on this one before I started to put this first band of thread on. And that second band of tape is because I could just visually see that foot wanting to come up. So I need that foot to stay down until I get my first wrap on there. And I jumped the thread. I didn't jump a thread, my foot didn't stay. Instead of the thread climbing up the foot, it slid off the end. And there we go. And now I've got my thread going up the foot, so I can go ahead and pull this piece of tape off. And need to scooch my thread towards the butt just a little bit. And in this situation, going up these larger guides, or any of the guides, you really want to pay attention to the orientation of your thread carriage, because if your thread carriage is one way or the other, your thread's not going to go up on there properly. First off, you're going up a angled piece, and the thread's going to want to slip towards the downhill side, and then as it does that, on this side of your thread of your foot, and then the center and the other side, it's going to want to be up the rod. You can see it here. And so I'm just going to take my burnishing tool and scoot all my threads over a little bit as I go around. To try to keep that straight. And this is more of an issue on these larger feet, larger guides. Not as much of an issue on the smaller guides. Okay, so you can see that when you first start, when your thread first starts climbing up the leg of the guide, it'll want to jump off when you come around. And you know that that is a good stopping point for going how much thread to put on that guide. I like as much as I can get on the guides, because that thread's what's holding that guide there. And even though this is a crappie rod, as I mentioned earlier, I quite often catch large striper on a crappie jig, and I've caught catfish up to 15 pounds on a crappie jig. So I want to know for sure that those guides are well attached. Now the thread holds it, but also your epoxy holds it. But I'm kind of a extra mile kind of guy, so I just make for certain. And that guide's not going anywhere. I can actually leave that one as it is and move up to the next guide and get one side wrapped on it, 1 foot, and then 1 foot on the next guide, and then run my line through it and make sure my guides are lined up correctly if I am in any way not certain. Although I've done this a bunch of times and I'm pretty certain, so I'm going to go ahead and just wrap these as I go. Well, I now have my spiral wrap complete. And you can see my guides slowly going from the 0 axis to the 180 degree axis of the rod. So all that's left for me to do is look my thread over, make sure everything's nice. Make sure my guides are all straight out here on this end, which I do that by eye, even though this rod wrapper has an attachment for a laser beam that you can use to straighten your guides. I haven't been able to get that laser beam to work well for me. So I generally hold the rod up against a white background and just look down the blank and line up the guides. So once I've gone over and made sure everything is just right, then I can put my epoxy over my rod. And I will show that as I'm doing that, and I'll mention that I've got a very small piece of scissors, my rod building scissors, on the end of this fishing line to keep it tight. I don't want it real tight, like, you know, a half-pound weight out on the end. I just need an ounce or two to hold the line straight so that I can make sure that my cast, that I'm not going to lose any casting distance. Anyway, this is it for putting on the guides, and we'll pick up again when I start doing the epoxy.